to boycott slave-made goods. This began in the 1820s and was a movement called the Free Produce Movement. And the idea was that people who opposed slavery needed to not buy goods that were made by slaves. And the argument made by these free produce abolitionists was that purchasing slave-made goods was tantamount to hiring a slave yourself. So what they tried to do was say, there's really no moral difference between being a slave owner and a consumer of slave-made goods. Essentially, you're supporting the slave owner and you're supporting the system of slavery. And so this was a movement that was never particularly large, but had a big social impact. And the other thing that this group did was they set up stores in which they sold what they called free produce, that is, goods that were made by non-slave labor, by free labor. And their idea was that as more and more Americans bought goods from free produce stores, slave owners would have an incentive to switch over from hiring and purchasing human beings as slaves to purchasing free wage laborers for their employment. The movement never succeeded. The free produce stores were not economically successful, but I argue in my book that they set an important precedent of not only the boycott, which had gone back to the American Revolution, but also what today we call the boycott, which is to kind of try to not only punish those who are doing things you don't like, but to reward those who are doing things that you do like. And the free produce stores were among the first in human history that I've discovered that did that. For a lot of consumer activists, there was no difference between buying power and political power. Buying power, they argued, was a kind of political power, not the only kind of political power, but they argued that in a society that was no longer a subsistence society, in other words, Americans were not making goods for themselves. We were a market-based society from the very early 19th century. Therefore, when you purchase goods, you were establishing relations. These were invisible because you didn't see the farmer who grew the wheat that you bought to make the bread that you bought, or the butter that you used, or the clothing that you wore, or eventually the technology that more and more Americans were buying. But even though you didn't see them, you had a very real and direct connection to them. And indeed, you were morally responsible for the conditions in which they worked. And this idea was repeated again and again through the 19th into the 20th century. And the idea here was that if you define politics broadly as how we treat one another, how we, the kind of ethical systems that are important to us, then buying power was a form of political power. Now, in the 20th century, consumer activists began to talk more explicitly